This phase of the painting really provides me with a challenge for our video because on one hand, I can say the base rendering phase is the longest part of the painting. In the entire duration of this process, it was probably half of the time I spent. But it is also very boring. This does not make for good TV, so I'm going to spare you. But in brief, I think of this phase as getting the primer on the car. Because if you wanted to paint a car, first you would need to sand it down so it's very beautiful and flat, and then you would spray on the primer, and only then would you be allowed to do the cool part, which is the actual painting. Now, the paint itself wouldn't take very long. Really, all the work is in the preparation, and really that's how the base render phase works for me. So here I've drawn just a couple little shapes, and we're going to pretend this is the whole image, and I'm going to give you a quick example of what the process looks like, and then we're going to show the actual painting. And there's really a lot of different ways to describe what it is I'm doing, but the most simple would be to say we're going from a line drawing that has tone to a painting. And to me, the distinction is that a painting generally does not have lines. So whether you're erasing the lines on their own layer, or like I am here, just incorporating them into the flat painting itself, we are moving from lines to edges. I'm going to work on that transition from light to dark. If there are visible terminators, now's when I refine them. And I'm going to do everything short of actually putting in the surface texture. So any of that sort of small scale bumpiness is for a later phase. Right now, all I'm doing is sort of pretending these are the simplified materials. Now, it's a very important phase because really this is when you add the realism to your drawing. This is when you have the most control over how light and form are represented, and it gives you a fantastic foundation that we are later going to put a little bit of photo detail on top of. But really, this is the bread and butter of your painting. Here's where we take all we learned about casting shadows, about the angle of the light, about relative value. All the things we've talked about in basic rendering are tested in this phase. This is where studying still lifes pays off. This big image is a still life. It's objects in space that are being illuminated by a light source. That's it. And so we do this over the entire painting, and it takes a really long time. But believe me, you do not want to take shortcuts. We are going to be doing photo overlay later, but it won't look good unless this underlying primer, if you will, looks nice. So here we are. We are using every bit of the canvas, and we are just refining edges and adding polish. This is exactly like what we did in Basic Rendering 1, except for one key difference. In Basic Rendering 1, we just had a single shape with a single material, so we didn't really need to think about value relationships. Here we have a much more complex scene, and we have a lot of different objects all sort of battling for our attention. So it might be hard to understand why I'm making each of these individual choices as you watch me work here. But it really is a little more simple than it looks, because my first strategy is get rid of the line work. Anywhere where there's a line eventually is going to be replaced by two values, and where those values meet will give the impression of an edge, not a line. So the question then becomes, how do I approach each of those edges? Because remember, the danger here is I don't want to have too much contrast. The more contrast I add in at this point, the more distracting the image becomes. And I want the clarity of that initial rough. So generally speaking, whenever I come to an edge and I want to get rid of the line work and make it turn into two values up next to each other, it's a question of how much contrast do I put in? A lot of times my block-in will leave me with lines that don't have any value change on either side. It's like one tone with a line or a couple lines describing a shape. So in that case, what I do is I just darken one side of the line a little bit and lighten the other side. So in this case, you can see visual separation, you can see plane change, but it's not adding too much contrast. Remember, when we zoom out, this is where we see our sort of composition-wide contrast. There's a big difference between the color of the background and the tone of the character. That's on purpose. We don't want to challenge that. So when we are refining, we are working at a much smaller value scale. I might push up 5% brighter or 5% darker, not 15 or 20%. And really that's this entire phase. It is going edge by edge, line by line, finding anywhere where there's a line in my image and turning it into two tones next to each other. And so as a result, you can see my lines are actually flattened right into my canvas. Because at this point, I'm not so worried about solving problems anymore. I'm not worried about the image really changing or shifting around. That's why we worked in the way we did up to this point. I kept it loose and layered and had the ability to make radical changes earlier on. But now we're sort of established. I have solved the problems, and so as I refine, it's actually not very dangerous to flatten my line work right into the canvas. When it comes to getting rid of those lines and replacing them with tones, it's actually kind of nice if your line work is flattened in. Because what's that saying is, I've committed. I am not gonna sort of try this and try that. I am totally on board with this design. I've gotten rid of my flexibility. Now it's time to just work it into the canvas. And from a technical standpoint, I find it's a little bit easier to get rid of lines when they are flattened right into your tones. You can mask away and sort of slowly hide the lines and then replace them with paint. But if it's all one layer, you will find that they integrate much more quickly. So in the same way that I talked about removing an edge by pushing up one side a little bit brighter and then the other side a little bit darker, that same sort of small scale value tweaking is how we're going to add details into the shadow areas in our composition. Because at this point, there's not a lot of detail going on in the foreground, but we really want to have some interest there. It can't look totally flat. So as I paint the bricks here, for instance, what you're seeing is a very slight push in the values, getting a little bit brighter, and it's allowing me to show some of the surface quality of that brick. Now, you don't want to go too heavy-handed with this. Remember, when you zoom out, you should not be able to see too much definition. This is really only something that you see on closer inspection. Because if you look at photos as reference, the areas of shadow really have very, very low contrast, and that's what we're going for. We're going to have some details, but to not push that local contrast too high. So no matter how hard we try, sometimes we just get contrast creep. And I've noticed that's happening here in the sort of white stucco area of my middle ground. So what I need to do is to lower the contrast. I want it to be more of a single tone of sort of brightly illuminated paint. And when I need to lower contrast, one of my favorite techniques is to just grab a big soft airbrush and paint with very low flow on top. So I'll just sample one of the values that I like, and then I'll just sort of soften it out. Here I'm almost just covering up all that high contrast that accidentally snuck its way in there. And the end result is sort of a flatter, less contrasty tone. I watch a lot of digital painting tutorials, and it seems like a common idea now is that speed is important. We are speed painters. We are rapidly prototyping concepts. Well, when it comes to this phase of a painting, I'd argue that what you want is being slow. You want to be methodical. You are carefully describing form and light and shadow, and that's not something you really want to rush. So in a minute, we're going to get to the final sort of texturing, polish, overlay phase, but I really just can't stress enough how important this part of the process is. Refining the form and the value relationships right now, making it look clean before you get detailed, is the best way that I've found to make a really polished end result. So put on some good music, get in a comfortable state of mind, because you're just going to be at this for a while. This is one of those slow parts of the process that there's really no shortcutting.